Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. I hope you enjoy. The Broken Oath, written by T. Marcos. All right, Ethan sighed, taking a seat and sliding the photograph between 2 pages of his notebooks. When did you see him last? The woman sitting across from him took a moment before she spoke, visibly hovering on the edge of tears. Almost 5 days ago, she replied. He hadn't come home the night before. Nobody at his studio had seen him. His father's funeral was that weekend. She shook her head, breaking off with clenched fists. I thought he had gone to the bars, so I went to look. I saw him walking on the street with another woman. Ethan jotted a few notes down in his notebook, then looked up at the woman. Ma'am, I think I know the answer to this, so please forgive me for asking. But have you tried contacting the police? Her mouth twisted bitterly. They told me to talk to a divorce attorney, she said. They wouldn't listen. Mr. Carlyle, I looked right into Jeff's eyes. He didn't recognize me. Something is very wrong, and nobody but... She bit her lip, realizing that the rest of her sentence could be considered somewhat rude. Ethan chuckled. It's all right, he reassured her. I'm aware of my reputation. It's not undeserved. So, you think that there's something, she said, sounding equally horrified and relieved. You think that's what's happened to Jeff isn't normal? He sighed and leaned back in his chair, giving her a level look. I think it sounds similar to a few other cases I've worked on, which makes me genuinely optimistic, he cautioned her. I won't know more until I've had a chance to dig through the details. What do you need to know? She asked. I'll tell you anything I can remember. Ethan flipped to a new page over in his notebook. You said his father died recently, he muttered, looking up at her for confirmation. Yes, she said. Cancer, a couple of weeks back. Do you think that it has something to do with Jeff's disappearance? Ethan suppressed an annoyed look, having long ago developed an immunity to inane and obvious questions of anxious relatives. Deaths and traumatic events are often important, he said vaguely. You said he went to the funeral just before he disappeared. She nodded. He spent the weekend in Cleveland with his brother, going through his father's things. He came back, he seemed fine, and then... She trailed off, lip quivering. I just want him to come home. I'll do my best to make that happen, Ethan assured her. With what I know so far, it's looking very promising. She got up and shook Ethan's hand before turning to the door. Mr. Carlyle, she said, thank you for listening. Ethan inclined his head, and seconds later the door clicked shut behind her. He took the photograph from his notebook and studied it. A smiling, scruffy man, with a leavening of grey in his beard, was posing in front of a white backdrop. A remote trigger for a camera clutched in one hand. Artists, Ethan mustered. Oh, this is going to be such a pain in the arse. The townhouse was modest, understated, and currently vacant, according to the helpful building manager. When Ethan had inquired about potentially touring it, however, the woman's eyes had gone a bit glassy and she had offered to show a different property. The telltale signs of influence had been all over her, which was all the confirmation Ethan needed. He sighed. There was some irony in the fact that the muses had no artistry to them, nothing but thoughtless and ham-handed nestling behavior once they scented their peculiar blend of tragedy and talent that worked on them like catnip. Left to her own devices, she'd probably leave Jeff in a few weeks, stumbling, incoherent, and likely divorced. Sometimes, though, the blend was just a little too sweet, the artists too rare. Muses drank men like that down with the last drop, leaving only a withered husk and the posthumously immortality of art. Raphael, Zerikau, Seurat, and Besquet. But not Jeffrey Kleiner, if Ethan could help it. He didn't think the vaguely avuncular photographer was much of a risk of becoming a tragic cornerstone of his field, but he never gambled with paying customers. Ethan took a few steps towards the door and felt the beginnings of a pull on his mind, the warding embrace of the muses shunting him away from the man in her ravenous embrace. He felt the urge to go take a walk, to get a coffee, to do anything but walk through that door. Sighing, he took out a token from his pocket and glanced at the rune carved into it. A prick to his thumb sent blood spilling onto it, and he felt his will take hold, the wood crumbling through his fingers. The urges stopped, but now she knew he was here, and, more importantly, a threat. The air thrummed with tension as he felt the weight of her focus come to bear. "Come on," he muttered. "You've had your fun. Let this guy go home to his wife. Go nibble on some folks taking a pottery elective." He walked up to the steps and raised his hands to the doorknob, searching through his coat for an unlocking he had stowed there. The door blew off its hinges, throwing him back onto the front walk in a tumble. Ethan could feel the heat pouring from the townhome, crackling through the air in restless surges and crisping the grass. He rolled onto his side and looked up, immediately regretting his cavalier attitude towards the job. A woman stood in the ruined doorway, tall with a runner's build. Her hair was fiery and cropped short, her skin olive and flawless, eyes as black as the depths of the earth fixed on him with rage. She stalked over to where he lay and glared down at him. "You broke my wards," she hissed. "You have doomed us." "My mistake," Ethan wheezed, trying to raise himself to a seated position. "Really sorry. Meant to go to one house down. I'll just see myself out." Her eyes blazed with a dull red light, and she bared her teeth. "You've overstepped, mortal," she sneered. "I was never drawn to hubris." The woman reached down and grabbed his collar, lifting him bodily off the ground. Ethan tried to pry her hand loose, but her grip was unyielding steel. She drew back her hand to strike, and paused, her head cocked to the side. "Tch," she spat. "Always annoying ones that are useful." She shifted her grip to the back of his collar and began dragging him up the steps unceremoniously. "Hey, wait," Ethan croaked, still reeling from the tumble off the steps. "Seriously, this is not necessary. I'll leave. I'll refund my client." "Shut up," she said, tossing him onto the couch and glancing irritably at the ruined door frame. There was a crackling noise as the door shot back into place. The wood knitted together and the hinges reformed with a squeal of twisting metal. Ethan used her brief distraction to look around. The house was sparsely decorated in the soulless manner of a show unit, with thoughtless art and plastic plants scattered around. He could see back to the dining area where a man sat slouched over the dining table. His elbows nudged a bowl of fake fruit jauntily, placing it at its center. Jeff was less tidy than in the photo, but still recognizable. Ethan frowned. Normally the man would be busy with art, so involved in his passions that he could scarcely notice Ethan's presence. This man seemed similarly unaware, but he was just brooding. The woman stalked in front of him, interrupting his study of the missing photographer. "You," she said, holding out her hand to him. In her palm was a small golden coin engraved with the image of a snake. "Take the coin." Ethan looked at the coin skeptically. "No offense, but I really don't want to," he said. Her eyes glittered with anger, and she thrust it closer to him. "Take it," she hissed. "No!" It sat in her palm, round and glistening. Ethan noted the centuries of wear on the coin, the faded lettering around the edges. "In my experience," he said softly, "it's never a good idea to accept that sort of offer that requires a choice made freely." The woman slapped him across the face, hard. Ethan fell over sideways with blood flecking his lips. He lay there for a moment, dazed, before she hauled him back upright. Her eyes were featureless and dark as she studied him. "You're not like the other human, even if you are one of mine," she muttered. "Why are you different?" Ethan spat blood onto the floor and shook his head. "You're one to talk," he muttered. "What the hell sort of muse are you?" The woman snorted and gave him an irritated glare. "Even my useless nieces could have dealt with you easily," she said. "Now take the coin, or we will both die." Ethan blinked. "Let's, back up a second," he said. "Why are we dying?" She gave him a flat look. "If it'll hasten matters," she sighed. "That man," she said, jerking a thumb at Jeff, "is one of mine. His father passed into Hades and left his wealth to his 2 sons. The other brother took more than was his right, and in what remained this one found my coin." She flexed her fingers, the curling of them into a fist. "It's an old story, simple, strong. His own blood sings for justice due to a thief. My justice." Ethan's eyes widened as things clicked together in his head. Divine beings came in all forms with corresponding tastes. The more recently ascendant varieties tended to prefer complex abstracts, like good done unto the needy or the slow corruption of a soul. Some, like muses, fed on byproducts of passion and pain that stemmed from closer to the root of the human spirit. But there were older creatures who preferred simpler fare. Bloody retribution for the wronged was the primordial impulse. meet for things that were born from blood under eternal starless night. Ethan looked up at the Fury and gulped. So, he said, I'm guessing there's an issue with the justice. Astute, she snorted. The father had more than my coin in his trove. What the brother stole was trouble. What sort of trouble? Ethan asked. You mistake me, she sighed. It was trouble, disorder, a small flute in form. Ethan blinked. A flute, he said, feeling ice trickle down his spine. As in a pan flute. The Fury nodded. You understand, she said. The brothers fear my retribution feeds it. With every moment it bleeds into paranoia, mania, panic. Ah, shit, Ethan said. Phobophages were the worst sort of trouble simply because their aspect was so contagious. Left unchecked, a feeding frenzy could easily reach pandemic levels. A literal fear god turned loose in the heart of a city could mean the death of thousands. Again astute, she said, holding up the coin. So take it. Ethan drew back, looking at her curiously. What justice is there to do on my behalf? He asked. Nobody's stolen anything from me. She looked at him as their eyes blared a dusky red once more. 3 are my domains, she whispered. Infidelity, theft, and breaking of oaths. No, Ethan said, feeling sick knot in his gut. No, absolutely not. An oath sworn, she insisted. An oath was broken. I can feel that marks of that on your soul, the scars from where you were wronged. Allow me to take up your vengeance. She loomed over him, seeming to fill the confines of the small room. The oath was mighty, so was its thundering. So will I be. None will stand in our path. He shook his head. You can't, he croaked. Some wrongs can't be righted. A low chittering laugh scuttled through the room at the corner of his hearings. He sat up with a start. The colors of the room began to waver, and the Fury turned to stare at the door with a hiss. He's coming, she said. You broke my wards, and now he is our scent. She held out her hand, proffering the coin incessantly. He'll die, as will all those near here. Take it. You don't realize what you're asking, Ethan mumbled. I know how this works. I've seen my share of divine justice. A lick of shadow flickered out of place. Afar into the distance, a woman began screaming. The Fury's eyes narrowed, but she did not interrupt him. You would get power enough to right the wrong. That's how this sort of thing works, she nodded. That is the contract, she confirmed. The power invested in the oath becomes mine. Ethan sighed and slumped back into the chair. Then there's no way I can take the coin, he said. Fool, she spat. You would condemn the city to death. She gestured as the straight lines of the wall began to warp and light from the window stretched out into glaring purple rays. Chaos is expanding its reach. Will you let your pride bury thousands, millions? She glared at him. I have a sister who will come for you, murderer. Your name, Ethan said. Give me your name and your solemn oath that you'll only use the power to seal the fruit. The Fury swelled with rage and loomed close to him. You dare ask this of me, she whispered, her voice like a bare knife at his neck. Will you let your pride bury thousands? Ethan asked innocently. Millions! Must you meet your sister? Impudent wretch, she snarled. Watched words she might have said next were torn away as the door burst off its hinges for the second time that afternoon, hurling into the foyer as little more than a cloud of splinters. Silhouetted in the doorway was a man, a rictus grin on his face and dancing color about his brow. He stood oddly, stilted and warped as he advanced into the room. Empty eyes turned towards the two of them, and when his head moved, Ethan could hear the broken vertebrae grinding against each other. The coin, she cried out. Please! Your name, Ethan replied firmly, and your oath. The figure in the doorway raised his hands. Ripples of sickening, colorless distortion fell languidly from his fingers, drawing gouges in the floor as he tottered towards them. The Fury went pale, then snarled a curse as she produced a small knife from her pocket. She raised a drop of blood from her finger and pressed it to her lips before pulling Ethan in for a long, angry kiss. His eyes shot open wide, but there was little he could do to free himself from her vice-like embrace. She broke the kiss and put her blood-stained lips against his ear, whispering a single word. Ethan looked at her and nodded. With trembling fingers, he took the coin from her palm. There was a blast of light that blew through the wavering shadows of panic, like so much gauze, temporarily casting every surface into a blinding white. When Ethan's vision cleared, he saw the Fury, but she wasn't, really, not anymore. Golden wings sprouted from her back, and a nimbus of light radiated from her brow. Her nondescript clothing had turned to white robes and gathered at her waist with a belt of fine silver. In one hand she held a sword, and Ethan knew its name was Judgment. She raised the blade and pointed at the avatar of Panic, who flinched. Radiance streamed from the sword's point and washed away its shadowed countenance, leaving only broken and bloody corpse on the floor. The brother, clutching the shattered remains of a flute, Ethan felt the grip of its fear slacken as the physical focus dissipated. The Fury's face was set in grim triumph, but Ethan saw in her eyes slowly turn upwards. She looked high up. Eyes of molten gold seemed to fix on something only she could see. Her grip on the sword tightened. "No!" Ethan shouted. "You can't!" "There is judgment to be rendered," she said, her voice echoing through the room. Pale light began to shine from the blade. Ethan gritted his teeth and forced his way closer, shielding his eyes from the glowing light. "You swore," he said. "You swore an oath, Mageria, she who punishes traitors." Another step. He could smell burning hair as the light intensified. "Mageria, Oathkeeper, I name you twice." He could feel the pain searing at his flesh as the light shone still brighter from the sword. "Mageria, Oathkeeper," he cried. "3 times I name you. I invoke the covenant sealed in blood." There was another flash, and Ethan was flung back to collide with a smouldering couch. When the purple smudges faded from his vision, he could see Mageria's slumped form on the floor, surrounded by ashes and scorched feathers. He staggered over and knelt beside her. She drew a raging breath, shuddered with each inhalation. He tilted her head up and pressed 2 fingers to her forehead, murmuring softly. After a moment, her eyes snapped open and fixed on him, tears welling up at the corners. "I did not believe you," she said quietly, "that an oath like that would be sworn or broken. An oath given by—" Ethan touched her lips, holding her. "By someone who must remain as they are," he said gently. Mageria looked at him for a long moment before sitting up and shaking her head. "Every now and then it occurs to me that the decision to create humanity was a poor one," she grumbled. "Before you there was order, hierarchy. We had our roles. If someone was given the power to do a thing, it was because that thing was meant to be done by their hand. To have the power and to choose not to use it, that is uniquely human madness." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe there's a power in choice not made, just as there is power in oaths not kept," he said. She nodded, then straightened up. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but know this, mortal. Some choices cannot be unmade." She bent down to pick up the small, white-handed dagger with a golden blade. "You have opened the door of vengeance, and its instrument is created. One that is capable of meting out the justice that is your prerogative." Ethan stared at the small blades, eyes widening. "Wait, what?" he said. "That blade is a big fecking deal. I don't know how it's even still here in physical form. You definitely don't want to—" She held up a hand and cut him off. "It's your justice, so it'll not be used save by your leave," she sighed. "But the option will remain, now that you have invoked it. Judgment for the slight against you is one step closer. Now and to eternity." He sat back down on the burnt couch to daze. "It doesn't seem like that's something we should be able to do," he said weakly. "Don't assume that the upstarts of yours know everything," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. She sat down beside him, turning the dagger over delicately in her fingers. "There are secrets that were made and kept, things claimed long ago in the lightless dark. For me and my kin, the path is constrained, limited, yet absolute within its boundaries." Ethan cocked his head and looked at her, then at the dagger she was idly flipping in her hands. "Mageria," he said, "has anyone ever told you that you're a bit terrifying?" "Yet I did not create this," she said, waving the dagger in his face. "This is why humans were a mistake. The unconstrained path leads to strange destinations." She smiled at him, the expression stopping well short of her eyes. "Also, if you let my name touch your lips again, I'll kill you." Ethan smiled back. "How about Meg?" he asked. "I will eat your liver," she warned. There was a groan from the kitchen, and Ethan looked somewhat abashed. "Shoot! Almost forgot about Jeff," he muttered. "Listen, I'm not a big fan of liver," he said, "but after I drop Jeff off, do you want to get some coffee? Assuming nobody's burned down the shop, that is." Her eyes narrowed. "I sprang forth from the sky's blood, spilled into the wine dark sea by Titan's hand," she said. "I do not go get some coffee. It is not my path." Ethan shook his head. "Well, it is definitely mine," he said. "Offer stands, if you're interested." Mageria looked around the scorched apartment, her eyes lingering on the debris and chaos scattered everywhere. "A mistake," she sighed. "Definitely a mistake." Ethan walked back into the room with Jeff leaning heavily on him. "Is that a yes?" he asked. She rolled her eyes. "Come on," she said. "I'll help you get him into the car." She moved to Jeff's other side and grabbed him under the shoulder, lifting the man up easily. Even so, her steps carried greater weight than before. The dagger hung at her side, shining bright, and every time Ethan saw a hint of its light, he could not help but shiver. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, Lord Azrakal, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon WRE, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.